The first interruption came like a crack of thunder in a clear sky. Jasmine Crockett had barely finished her opening sentence when Stephen Miller lunged forward, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. The microphone screeched, jolting the room into a restless stir. Heads turned. Some leaned forward, others recoiled. The sound of Miller's interruption wasn't just rude, it was invasive, calculated, designed to knock her off balance before she had even begun. The moderator froze for half a breath, pen hovering, eyes darting between the two figures as if to silently ask, was this really happening already? Miller's words weren't just an objection, they were an attempt to seize control, to dominate the stage through sheer volume. His tone dripped with dismissal, the kind of confidence that comes not from being right, but from believing he could talk his way into victory by silencing someone else. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't fire back. She held her posture, shoulders squared beneath the hot glare of the lights, her silence a blade sharper than his words. For a fleeting moment, that silence was louder than Miller's interruption. It forced the audience to confront the sheer audacity of what they'd just witnessed. A man cutting off a woman before her thought could even breathe. Gasps rippled through the hall like a wave breaking against stone. Phones tilted upward, the red dots of cameras blinked alive. A clip was already being born, destined to travel farther than anyone in that room imagined. The outrage wasn't just about the words Miller spoke, it was about the principle, the power dynamic, the arrogance on full display. And in that moment, every progressive, every immigrant family, every young voter watching felt a surge of recognition. Here it was again. The old game of interruption, of erasure, played right in front of their eyes. But see, something else hung in the air too, an almost electric anticipation. Because Crockett didn't crumble under the weight of that interruption. She was still there, composed, her hands resting calmly, her expression unreadable but charged. The audience didn't yet know what she was holding back. No one knew then, but it would take just 7 words to flip the entire debate on its head. This wasn't just another televised debate. It wasn't background noise for a bored public scrolling their phones. The stakes in that room were heavier than the chandeliers overhead, pressing down on every word, every gesture, every pause. What unfolded on that stage would ripple outward, beyond the hall, beyond the cameras, into the bloodstream of a country already trembling with division. Because this moment was never really about policy bullet points or procedural details. It was about who gets heard in America, and who gets silenced. It was about whether dignity could still cut through the noise, whether truth could still matter in a political culture addicted to interruption and spectacle. For Stephen Miller, the interruption was a tactic, a tried-and-true strategy from the old playbook. Speak louder, faster, more aggressively, and your opponent will shrink in the shadow of your voice. To him, it was just muscle memory. Flood the air, leave no room for the other side. And for years, that method had worked. The bully's edge had shaped narratives, hijacked headlines, and drowned out nuance. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another name on a panel. She represented something far larger than herself. To the progressive audience watching, she carried the weight of communities too often dismissed, too often talked over. She was a reminder that the fight for space at the microphone is the fight for space in the American story. Culturally, the clash symbolized a collision of eras, an old guard clinging to domination by disruption, and a rising generation insisting that calm, deliberate truth-telling was its own form of strength. Socially, it was a referendum on respect. Could a black woman, unshaken by 6 calculated interruptions, stand firm and not only hold her ground but turn the tables? Every viewer knew this wasn't trivial. Families watching at home felt it in their bow-ness. Immigrant parents who'd been dismissed by bosses or bureaucrats. Young people who'd been told to wait their turn. Women who'd had their voices cut short in boardrooms and classrooms. All of them were invested in whether Crockett would not only survive Miller's barrage, but redefine the terms of battle. And in the crowd, the tension was visible. Eyebrows arched, Phones hovered, ready to capture a moment that could ignite social feeds. Reporters scribbled, eyes sharp for the headline. The air was thick, as if everyone sensed they were standing on the edge of something bigger than two people trading words. This wasn't just theater. It was a test of America's pulse. Miller leaned back after his first interruption, confident, almost smug. He believed he'd set the tone, seized the power dynamic, made Crockett reactive. But what he didn't realize was that he had just awakened something deeper in the room. Outrage was already bubbling. Respect for Crockett's restraint was already rising, and anticipation was already crackling in the silence between their words. The audience wasn't just waiting for her answer. They were waiting for a reversal, a moment to prove that interruption wasn't invincibility. And Crockett, calm but unshaken, was still holding back. And when Miller opened his mouth the second time, jaws dropped. Stephen Miller had long perfected the art of interruption. To him, it wasn't rudeness, it was strategy, a weapon sharpened over years of political trench warfare. Long before this debate, his voice had been the battering ram he wielded against opponents who dared to finish a sentence without his permission. He thrived in chaos, feeding off the disruption he created. In his world, whoever could shout the longest and loudest controlled the narrative. His reputation preceded him. This was the man who had once ghost-written entire policy blueprints built not on inclusion, but on exclusion. A man who crafted speeches meant to divide, who wore disdain as casually as a pressed suit. Miller wasn't just a participant in America's culture wars. He fancied himself an architect of them. His interruptions weren't isolated incidents. They were the audible echoes of a philosophy rooted in domination. For years, he operated in the shadow of power, whispering lines into the ears of leaders, lines designed to harden borders and close doors. His words carried the weight of cold certainty, as though compassion were weakness and empathy a distraction. He believed control was everything, and that control began with the microphone. Whoever spoke, uninterrupted, owned the truth. Whoever cut in mid-thought seized the ground. That was his game. Audiences had seen it before. Miller at hearings, Miller at press briefings, Miller in backroom negotiations. Always the same pattern. Interrupt, overwhelm, distort, declare victory before anyone else had the chance to breathe. It wasn't dialogue he sought, but dominance. And if his smirk after the first interruption seemed familiar, it was because it belonged to a man convinced the script was already his. But arrogance has a way of curdling in the public eye. By the time he faced Jasmine Crockett, Miller's style was no longer novel. It was predictable. People were weary of the constant barrage, the way he chewed up airtime and spat out slogans. They recognized the tactic for what it was, desperation masquerading as authority. Still, he carried himself with the same dismissiveness, the same assumption that his interruptions would rattle yet another opponent into stammering submission. What he didn't account for was the audience, both in the room and across the nation, had changed. The hunger for cheap theatrics was waning. The hunger for dignity, for steady strength in the face of noise, was rising. Every time Miller spoke over Crockett, he wasn't just silencing her, he was revealing himself. Each interruption was a mirror, reflecting his own fear that truth, calmly spoken, might be stronger than all his bluster combined. In that hall, the resentment was palpable. People shifted in their seats, sighs punctuated the air, and cameras zoomed tighter on his face, capturing the sneer, the cutting hand gestures, the impatience that oozed from every fiber of his body. Miller thought he was displaying control. What he was really displaying was insecurity dressed in arrogance. And still, he pressed on. 6 times he cut her off, each more aggressive than the last, as though sheer repetition would grind her into silence. 6 times he mistook interruption for victory, as if the scoreboard rewarded noise over clarity. But the audience wasn't keeping score the way he thought. They were watching the imbalance, the bullying, the arrogance. They were waiting, almost begging, for the moment the script flipped. Because every villain needs a downfall. Every arrogance begs to be punctured. And Miller, with each smug interjection, was writing his own undoing. But Crockett had a history of her own, one that would make her seventh line unforgettable. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin under the bright lights of a televised debate. It began in the quiet corners of neighborhoods where opportunity wasn't handed out, where voices like hers had to fight to be heard. Raised with the lessons of hard work and resilience, she learned early what it meant to carry both struggle and pride. Her family's story echoed that of so many Americans: sacrifice in the face of closed doors, dignity in the face of dismissal. She grew up understanding that if you wanted a seat at the table, you sometimes had to build the table yourself. Her toughness wasn't born in politics. It was forged long before, in classrooms where expectations were low, but her determination was high, in courtrooms where she stood for clients who couldn't afford anyone else, in the daily grind of serving those who had been told they mattered less. Jasmine carried the weight of those battles into every room she entered. And unlike the polished arrogance of Stephen Miller, her confidence wasn't manufactured. It was earned. She became an attorney not for prestige, but for protection. She defended the accused, the overlooked, the underestimated. She looked at the system and saw cracks where real people fell through, and she decided her job was to pull them back up. Every cross-examination, every closing argument sharpened her resolve. She wasn't just practicing law, she was practicing the art of speaking truth in spaces designed to drown it out. That path led her into public service, where she carried with her not the detachment of a career politician, but the urgency of someone who knew what it meant to be ignored. Constituents saw themselves in her, and in return, she never forgot them. She was fierce, yes, but her fierceness came from empathy. When she stood at a microphone, she carried 1,000 unheard stories on her shoulders. Crockett's rise wasn't meteoric in the traditional sense. It wasn't fueled by dynasties or donor networks. It was scrappy, tireless, built on knocking doors and refusing to let cynicism dim her fire. She wasn't supposed to get this far, not in a system tilted toward the loudest and wealthiest, but every barrier she crossed only deepened her determination. And yet, for all her toughness, Jasmine never abandoned her humanity. She listened more than she spoke. She treated opponents with respect even when it wasn't returned. Her strength wasn't in mimicking the aggression of others, but in revealing that empathy and power are not opposites. They are allies. She embodied what so many in her audience yearned for, a leader who could be both unyielding and compassionate. That combination made her dangerous to someone like Stephen Miller. He had built his persona on domination, on drowning others out. But Crockett's very existence challenged that formula. She didn't need to be louder to be stronger. She didn't need to interrupt to command the room. Her authority came from the life she had lived and the people she represented. And when Miller's interruptions rained down on her, she knew exactly what they meant. To him, it was just another tactic. To her, it was a replay of every time she'd been underestimated, talked over, dismissed, told to wait her turn. She recognized the pattern because she had lived it, not just in politics but in life. And instead of shrinking, she gathered those memories like fuel. Every interruption only sharpened her focus, reminded her why she was there and for whom she was speaking. The audience may not have known the full depth of her story that night. They may not have traced her journey from defending the voiceless to representing a district, but they felt it. They felt the steadiness in her posture, the patience in her silence, the clarity in her gaze. And that resonance mattered. Because when a person carries truth, it radiates, even in silence, even under assault. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another debater waiting her turn at the mic. She was the embodiment of a larger struggle, The right to speak without being silenced, the right to be heard without being erased. And that made her far more dangerous to Miller than he ever realized. That's why, when she faced 6 interruptions in a row, she didn't break. The first interruption was sharp, sudden, like a jab meant to test her defenses. Miller lunged in, his words colliding with hers before she'd even completed a thought. The microphone whined with feedback, a piercing reminder of how quickly civility could be shattered. Crockett didn't blink. She allowed the pause to stretch, a calm silence filling the space he'd tried to steal. Viewers leaned forward, sensing the rhythm of a battle just beginning. The second interruption came faster, harder, dripping with condescension. Miller's voice cut across hers with the practiced arrogance of someone who believed volume equaled authority. A ripple of unease passed through the audience. Eyes narrowed, lips pursed. And this time, Crockett met his gaze directly, her expression steady, as if to say, "I've seen this before, and you won't shake me." By the third, patience was wearing thin, not hers, but the room's. Miller dove in mid-sentence, louder, more animated, a hand chopping the air as if sheer theatrics could erase the fact that she was the one speaking. Gasps broke out, scattered but audible. This was no longer just sharp elbows in debate, it was blatant disregard. And still, Crockett refused to be rattled. She straightened her notes, adjusted her mic, and continued with the precision of someone who knew her words carried more weight than his interruptions ever could. The fourth landed like a hammer. Miller's tone grew sharper, tinged with frustration, as though her composure was the very thing infuriating him. Some in the audience rolled their eyes, others shook their heads. A few muttered under their breath, irritation building. Crockett's response? Stillness. She breathed, deliberate and calm, letting his fury highlight itself. In that moment, she wasn't just defending herself, she was letting him unravel in plain view. By the fifth, the room had shifted. The interruptions were no longer surprising. They were predictable, mechanical, almost desperate. The audience's annoyance hardened into something else, resentment. Each time Miller spoke over her, the sympathy in the hall tilted toward Crockett, the respect deepening with every stolen second. She answered not with retaliation, but with a quiet persistence that turned the interruptions into background noise. She wasn't playing his game. She was rewriting it. The sixth was the breaking point. Miller surged in again, but this time the hall erupted. Not with cheers or boos, but with a sharp collective stillness. It was as though everyone recognized the pattern, and the weight of it pressed down on them all at once. The moderator shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Crockett's steady hands, her poised expression, the faint flicker of resolve in her eyes. By the sixth, the room was holding its breath, because no one saw the seventh coming. The seventh time he tried to cut her off, Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't snap or snarl or meet fire with fire. Instead, she did the one thing Stephen Miller never anticipated. She waited. She let his words barrel through hers, louder and more frantic than before, until his sentence ran out of steam. Then, with the patience of someone who had endured far worse than a man talking over her, she leaned slightly forward and delivered the line that stopped the night cold. 7 words. Calm. Precise. Devastating. The exact phrase seemed to hang in the air, like a bell toll echoing across stone. Crockett's voice was even, her tone unshaken. She didn't swing her arms, didn't pound the podium, didn't raise her pitch. She simply spoke those 7 words as if they were carved in steel, and the effect was instant. For a moment there was nothing. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the scratch of a reporter's pen. Just silence, thick and total, the kind of silence that only descends when a room knows it has just witnessed something irreversible. Time itself seemed to freeze. Then, slowly, the first murmurs broke out in the back rows. A ripple moved across the hall, like water spreading after a stone is dropped. Heads turned toward one another, wide-eyed. Eyebrows shot up, jaws unhinged, and somewhere in the middle rows, someone whispered a stunned, "Wow," that carried louder than they realized. Crockett didn't move. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. Her power was in restraint. She stood anchored at the microphone, as if to remind everyone that while Miller had spent the debate scrambling for control, she had never lost hers. She had let him burn through 6 rounds of arrogance, and with her 7th line, she had reduced his entire strategy to rubble. Miller's face betrayed him before his words could. The smirk faltered, the confident tilt of his chin slipped, his eyes darted left and right as though searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Cameras zoomed in close enough to catch it, the twitch in his jaw, the blink that lasted just a fraction too long. For a man who had built his career on never ceding ground, the cracks were now unmistakable. The audience, sensing blood, responded not with cheers but with something more powerful: awe. This wasn't a loud victory. It was a surgical one. Crockett had demonstrated that dignity could slice sharper than interruption, that poise could dismantle arrogance more thoroughly than any shouted retort. The silence after her words was not emptiness. It was recognition. Everyone in that room and everyone watching at home knew she had just claimed the night. The moderator cleared his throat, fumbling to regain order, but the moment had already outrun him. Phones were lifted higher. Fingers flew across screens. In the digital age, silence doesn't stay contained. It multiplies. The clip was already traveling, already breaking free of the hall's walls, already on its way to becoming something far larger than a debate highlight. And still, Crockett held steady. Her pause after delivering the line wasn't hesitation. It was intention. She wanted the weight of her words to settle before the conversation moved forward. She knew the power of timing, the drama of a held silence, the way dignity could command attention more forcefully than anger ever could. Every second she remained silent, Miller shrank further into the role of the overreaching antagonist. The camera cut back to him, but his reply landed flat, weak, unconvincing. He stumbled through a half-formed retort, his rhythm broken, his dominance gone. For the first time that night, the audience wasn't listening to him. They were waiting for her. And when she finally resumed speaking, she did so with a tone of quiet authority, as if reclaiming every word he had tried to steal. Each sentence was measured, deliberate, unhurried. Crockett wasn't just answering questions anymore. She was teaching a lesson, not only to Miller, but to every viewer who had ever felt interrupted, erased, or dismissed. The 7th interruption was supposed to be his final strike. Instead, it became her stage. In the crowd, you could feel the tide turning, not gradually, but in a wave. Reporters scribbled frantically, already crafting headlines in their heads. Audience members exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads at Miller's collapse, others smiling faintly at Crockett's composure. It was no longer a debate. It was a dismantling. What made it so powerful wasn't just her words, but the context, the 6 interruptions before them. Each had built the rhythm, like drum beats leading up to a crescendo. By the time her line landed, it wasn't just a statement. It was the release of pent-up outrage, the catharsis of watching arrogance undone by grace. And it wasn't only for the people in that hall. For the immigrant families watching on live streams, for the students, glued to clips on their phones, for the women who had spent lifetimes being cut off mid-sentence, this was vindication. It was proof that the game could be won another way. That interruption could be answered not with louder noise, but with precision, patience, and the unflinching strength of knowing who you are. Crockett didn't just speak for herself that night. She spoke for everyone who had ever been silenced. And with 7 words, she transformed the debate from another skirmish in the political circus into a parable about dignity and power. Miller shifted again, his face stiff, his voice rising in desperate protestations. But no one cared. His interruptions no longer mattered, because they had already been neutralized. The story had moved on, and it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the woman he couldn't silence. She had turned his arrogance into her platform. She had flipped the imbalance into her advantage. And with that seventh line, she had done something even Miller's loudest tirades could never achieve. She made the world stop and listen. But outside the hall, the real explosion was just beginning. The silence in the hall lasted only seconds, but online, the eruption was immediate. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's 7 words shot across social media with the velocity of a lightning strike. Within minutes, hashtags blazed across timelines. Hashtag she shut him down, hashtag 7 words, hash Crockett clapback. The moment wasn't just replayed. It was remixed, captioned, and memed into 1,000 variations, each one amplifying the same truth. Stephen Miller had been flattened by dignity, and the whole world had witnessed it. On TikTok, the clip looped endlessly, set to triumphant beats and dramatic sound effects. One version slowed the moment to half speed, freezing on Miller's stunned expression while Crockett's line echoed like a cinematic trailer. Another layered in applause, turning the hall's stunned silence into a standing ovation the internet supplied on her behalf. On Twitter, political commentators sparred over the meaning, but the momentum was clear. The crowd had already chosen their victor. Celebrities weighed in, some with playful jabs, others with pointed praise. A late-night host tweeted, "7 words, that's all it took. Somebody check if Miller's microphone is okay." Activists framed it more seriously, calling Crockett's composure a blueprint for handling aggression without stooping to it. Politicians, sensing the cultural wave, added their own takes, some congratulatory, others cautious, but all aware that the moment had become too big to ignore. By morning, headlines splashed the image across front pages. Crockett's calm mic drop echoes nationwide. 7 words that silenced Stephen Miller. Cable news rolled the clip every hour, each network dissecting her delivery, her composure, his unraveling. Panels debated whether this was just a viral moment or a sign of shifting political tides. But outside the polished studio walls, regular people already knew. It wasn't just a clip. It was a reflection of their own lived experiences. Messages poured in from women who had been interrupted in boardrooms, from young activists who'd been drowned out in meetings, from families who had been dismissed in public hearings. Crockett had become more than a politician on a stage. She had become a vessel for shared frustration, and more importantly, for shared triumph. Her poise wasn't just admired. It was claimed by those watching as proof that dignity could still win. In coffee shops and classrooms, in group chats and family dinners, the moment was replayed and retold. Students quoted her line as shorthand for standing firm. Parents showed their kids the clip as an example of grace under fire. It became a cultural shorthand, 7 words that carried the weight of 1,000 lived interruptions. Late-night monologues turned it into comedy, but even through the laughter, the resonance remained. "Interrupt her 6 times, one comedian quipped, and on the 7th, she'll write your political obituary." The audience roared, not just at the joke, but at the recognition of a truth too often ignored. What made the shockwaves so powerful wasn't only Crockett's line. It was the juxtaposition. The arrogance of 6 interruptions set against the elegance of her 7th response created a moral clarity people were starving for. In a world of constant noise, someone had finally shown that silence followed by precision could be the loudest sound of all. The ripple effect went further still. Fundraising numbers ticked upward. Supporters who had drifted grew energized again. Even critics who had once dismissed her grudgingly acknowledged the force of her composure. She had seized a narrative that Miller thought belonged to him, and in doing so, shifted the balance of power, not just in that hall, but in the broader conversation about who gets to speak and who gets heard. And yet, for Crockett, this was never just about a comeback line. Jasmine Crockett never let the moment rest on spectacle alone. To her, the power of those 7 words was not in humiliating Stephen Miller, but in proving a principle larger than the debate stage. She understood the temptation of viral fame, the satisfaction of watching a rival stumble. But when the cameras turned back to her, she refused to let the story remain small. She lifted it. She reframed it. She made it about something that would outlast both her and Miller. She reminded the audience, both in the hall and across the country, that politics is not measured by who can shout the loudest. It is measured by who can stay rooted in truth when the noise threatens to drown it out. She framed her calm not as strategy, but as service. Service to those who had trusted her to carry their voices. Service to the belief that dignity is not weakness, but strength. Her words were not vengeful. They were steady, almost tender, as she explained that arrogance always burns itself out, while dignity endures. She reminded viewers that interruptions can silence a sentence, but they cannot erase conviction. And most of all, she made it clear that this night was not about ego, it was about example. If she could stand against arrogance and hold her ground, then so could anyone watching who had ever been told to sit down, quiet down, or back down. The hall grew quiet again, this time not from shock, but from reflection. You could feel the weight of her message pressing into the audience, transforming the confrontation from a skirmish into a sermon. This wasn't a clapback. This was a compass. Online, commentators began to quote her more expansively, realizing that the story wasn't just Miller's arrogance, it was Crockett's restraint. Parents who had once tuned into politics with weary cynicism found themselves pointing to her example for their children. Teachers replayed her words in classroom. Ms. Faith leaders wove her message into sermons. Her dignity had crossed beyond politics into culture, into morality, into the way people thought about how power should be used. Crockett had turned a clash of egos into a universal truth. That service means listening, that leadership means composure, that power is hollow without respect. And in that way, she didn't just shut Miller down. She elevated the very definition of victory. Her crescendo wasn't thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of crescendo that grows from within, that makes people sit taller, breathe deeper, believe a little more firmly that decency still matters. In a political culture addicted to conflict, Crockett reminded people that dignity is not only possible, it is unstoppable when wielded with clarity and courage. Because what happened that night wasn't just about Miller or Crockett, it was about all of us. Stephen Miller interrupted Jasmine Crockett 6 times. He thought his voice, his force, his arrogance would win the night. But on the 7th? With just 7 words, she proved that dignity cuts deeper than disruption, that truth stands taller than ego. That's why people are still talking about it, not because a man shouted, but because a woman refused to bow. And that is the lasting lesson. Every time we are interrupted, dismissed, or pushed aside, we carry a choice. We can mirror arrogance with more arrogance, or we can rise, sharpen, and remind the world that dignity doesn't just survive, it triumphs. Crockett showed us that power isn't measured in interruptions. It's measured in composure, in courage, in service. This wasn't just a debate moment. It was a cultural marker. A reminder that no matter how many times arrogance tries to break through, truth always has the last word. And tonight, that word belongs to all of us. So here's what I want you to do. Don't just watch this story. Become part of it. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that dignity still wins. Subscribe if you believe arrogance has had the mic for too long. And join this movement, because voices like Crockett's aren't just rare, they're essential. The night Miller tried to silence her became the night she spoke for millions. And the ripple effect of her 7 words? That's still growing, 1 share, 1 voice, 1 story at a time. Because when arrogance interrupts, dignity responds. And that is how history shifts.